Welcome to the first part of our finance module, where we're going to be talking about a case study that I worked on during the pilot scheme, which should give you an indication of a typical and very standard social property investment project, and one that potentially you could go away and read for yourself. I'm going to stay with this case study right the way through the rest of the training, and so you can learn from things that went right with that property and things that went wrong with that property too, and things that we had to improve on for when we went on to do future projects. So I've mentioned it already, but I'm not qualified as a financial advisor, so please do be aware as you're watching the training and following through that the advice I'm giving you is purely as a demonstration of work that I've done with others, and it's to guide you and maybe spark off some creative thought and some innovation within yourself, and maybe spark off looking down some different avenues and maybe innovating in some way. So please do get professional advice if you want to take these strategies further and you're wanting to invest sums of money into projects such as the projects that we're going to be talking about here, and just use the guidance that I'm giving here as some best practice and some guidance from somebody that's been through the process already and has learned from the research projects that we've done. So let's move on and have a look at a case study. And this was a property which, as I say, I worked with on the pilot scheme, and it was quite easy to obtain this type of property. I've mentioned it already that this was actually being let to students, and it had been let to students for quite a long time. There was no mortgage on the property, it was owned outright. So there was no huge restrictions in terms of how that property was going to be used moving forward. It was already licensed as a house of multiple occupation, and so met all of the requirements of the local authority in terms of health and safety and legal aspects. And as I say, there was no mortgage on the property, so there wasn't anything huge that needed to be done other than informing parties of the change of circumstance. Insurance was another aspect that needed to be looked at, but there wasn't a huge amount that needed to be done in order to change the use of this building and let it to people claiming benefits as opposed to students and people who are in the university. So the way we know that this is going to be a viable investment is by taking a look at the local housing allowance figures for the area, and this can be done via the National Landlord Association site, and you can have a look at the figures for the area that you want to work in or that you found a property in, and you can calculate whether that's going to be a viable investment and how much rent you could be looking at getting back every year if you were to let to benefit claimants. So the local housing allowance rates are set by the valuation office, and they're renewed each year, and they tend to stay roughly the same. They may go up or down with a couple of pounds, but generally they tend to stay about the same. And I've got some examples of LHA rates here for over a couple of year period for Greater Manchester, and you can see the typical rates that we're working with in this marketplace. So we could see from this property here that with the local housing allowance rate, we would take a rental income back in on that property of over £12,000 a year. So we know that that's going to be a similar rate to as it was being let with students. So it should produce a really good yield and rental return for the landlord. So that's how we know in a really simplified manner if the figures are going to stack up in terms of working with rental income. And if you're working on a multi-let strategy, generally you're going to see a higher rental return and a higher yield than if you're working on just a family let. It was just one rental coming in. So obviously we know we're taking a higher risk when we're letting on a multi-let strategy, and we're going to get a higher reward for the risk that we're putting in for the risk that we're undertaking there. So this case study was actually moved in by 4 welfare claimants, and I'm going to use this as this was actually females that moved into this property, and they were all eligible for the single room rate of local housing allowance. So you can work this out by looking at your individual tenant circumstances, and you can go along to a site called I think it's www.entitled2.com, and you can enter in all tenant circumstances, and that's going to tell you in advance whether that tenant is going to be eligible for any housing benefits, any supportive type benefits, and also what level of rate that benefit is going to be paid at too. So we can see, I could go along, and when I met with the ladies that were going to be moving into the property, before we actually went ahead and let them move in, before we even let them view the property, we did a quick screen with them on the phone to make sure that they were going to be eligible for the housing benefit, and they were going to be okay to meet the needs of the tenancy, especially the financial elements of the tenancy. So that's the case study there that we worked with, and I said we're going to be staying with this case study as we move forward. Now, this case study, as I've mentioned, was already purchased. It was owned outright, and so there was no need to look at due diligence in terms of buying the property and purchasing, and whether the purchase price was going to stack up with the rental return. But that's obviously something that we're going to look at in the sections. What I want to look at next is, if we did have a property and wanted to buy it, or it was for sale, or it was vacant and we were interested in getting our hands on it, and it wasn't a simple clear-cut case of just working with a landlord as I did on the pilot scheme and letting them turn their voids into occupied units, and we wanted to go out and buy a property, or we wanted to purchase something, or we wanted to obtain a property in some way. It doesn't always have to be bought, remember, we can get our hands on property in lots of different ways. So in the next part, I'm going to be talking about exactly how we could look at using more creative methods to purchase buildings or obtain them. And as you probably know, if you're watching this video, obtaining a buy-to-let mortgage for an HMO containing LHA claiming tenants, so that's a house of multiple occupation and tenants in receipt of welfare, that's really, really, really tricky. And that's because it's deemed as a high risk strategy. So not a lot of mortgage buy-to-let companies will be happy to lend on those kind of terms. I think it is possible. You may be able to obtain finance that way, but it's very, very tricky. And so if we want to take this strategy to the mass marketplace, we've got to look at some more creative methods of getting these buildings financed and these projects set up and running. So in the next part, I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we've come up with via our research methods, and hopefully some new methods that you may be able to take away and help to put your project into place. So stay with us for the next part, which is going to be focused on lots of different methods of funding your project setup.